Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Geysha González, and I'm the Senior Vice President at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you today as we tackle the challenge of gendered disinformation. For 15 years, CEPA has been at the forefront of highlighting the challenge that disinformation poses to our democracies and the transatlantic alliance. Whether it's from Russia or China or other malign actors that seek to undermine our democratic values and institutions, we have sought to highlight these challenges and offer recommendations through the experts that we convene, the analysis that we publish, and the voices that we highlight. Today's subject on gender disinformation is no different. And today's conversation, we will tackle three key questions around this challenge: the how, the what, and the so what. Before I turn over to our distinguished experts for today, I would like to say a word of thank you to the U.S. Embassy in Bratislava for their kind support of this event. And I would also like to encourage all of you to follow along CEPA's work, whether it's on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, or going to cepa.org to find our latest publications. Today, I have the honor to speak with three experts who are leading the way on this subject. I have Arzu Geybulla, who is an activist and a journalist and the founder of Azerbaijan Internet Watch. Giovanna Sessa, who is a senior researcher at the EU Disinfo lab. And Katarína Klingová, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Democracy and Resilience at GLOBSEC. I'm going to first turn it over to Giovanna on really setting the scene for us on what is gendered disinformation, how do we define it, and how are they employed by actors, malign actors across the board? Giovanna.
Thank you so much, Geysha, and thank you to CEPA for their kind invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and I cannot wait to hear from the other experts as well. So, Geysha, I think that we need to start from the what, just a very quick operational definition. Gender disinformation, what is it? It's the creation and dissemination of deceptive or inaccurate content against women, especially women who hold positions of power, who are visible, who are public. And of course, then there are many nuances to this definition. I believe that it's important to maintain at this point an activist definition to understand that this topic is still in progress and that we should adapt our knowledge around it accordingly. And if I can say something regarding the direction that I hope this definition and this field takes is at some point overcoming, to say the least, such a binary conception. And so I believe that at this point we should consider gender in a broader sense that also includes gender identity and sexual orientation. So it is a very difficult topic to grasp, and I will let my colleagues after the other panelists get into it, but let's say that there are many issues at stake around the definition, and from this definition also concerning the types of actions that we might take, because it is something that exists at the intersection between disinformation and violence, because we are still to fully understand what is the relationship between something that happens online and the impact that it has offline. And also we have to consider case by case, because it is easy to draw into hate speech, and sometimes it's not illegal, but the so-called awful but lawful content that we're dealing with. So it's a very, very complex matter that comes in a variety of forms. I believe that unfortunately every one of us on the internet as women, as at least once experience some kind of slur, inappropriate comment, if not even threats. It is something that comes from a multiplicity of actors. So we have the state aligned, the private in groups or in individuals, and it has a multiplicity of goals. Although the ultimate goal, I think we can all agree, is to silence women, to deter them from participating in the public public debate. So I always like to say that disinformation mirrors the society in which it tries to enter, and if sexism and misogyny are a topic of our infosphere, of our society, then it is only natural that it reflects in the disinformation realm. And also, disinformation is something very adaptive. So if the, let's say, enemy at this point is feminism, and we live in an era where we are in the fourth wave of feminism, which means the positive use of the internet and intersectionality, then gender disinformation will weaponize these tools and use the internet, and also use belonging to marginal groups as a way to broaden its impact. And one last thing that I'd like to say is why populists, why autocrats is one of the questions that we were asked coming here today. So why does gender disinformation blink an eye to some type of populist and extremist and undemocratic ideology? Well, I believe that it lies in the fact that gender disinformation responds to transversal triggers, which is non-compliance to gender norms, the occupation of previously male-dominated spaces, and also, as I said, belonging to multiple marginalized groups. So these features speak to what political scientist Hans-Peter Krisi defined the so-called losers of globalization, that is the group of people that feel threatened by multiculturalism, by international cooperation, and rely on ultra-conservative ideals, on nativism, reject all type of diversity and inclusion. And then, as you can understand, the step is very short from these to xenophobia, homotransphobia, and misogyny. So this is something that exists transversally. We see it in Eastern Europe, and often as a form of cultural diplomacy, for instance, by powers such as Russia, but not only, as a form of opposition to the so-called Western liberal model. And it entails a performance of masculinity, of glorifying the patriarchy, of relaunching traditional gender roles and asking for the remasculinization of politics, which is, reclaiming the right to say basically what is politically incorrect. And we're starting to question as a society right now, luckily. So narratives are the same. We have the negative othering. We have the women who are either helpless victims, and if they are not, they are the evil manipulators who try to take advantage of some sort of situation. We have the obsession with gender ideology and the idea of a natural family meant by God between a man and a woman. And coming from Italy, I sure know about this. So we've seen it in multiple countries. We've seen it in Germany, and I only recall the awful campaign that was set against Annalena Baerbock, and which was crossed with her gender and which the green values she stands for. We've seen it also, and we keep on seeing it in Catholic countries, from Italy I just mentioned to also, for instance, in Portugal on the 22nd of January, there will be the legislative elections, and we have right now a far-right party, Chega Enough, which is conducting a very misogynistic type of campaign. And so, yes, overall, gender disinformation, I would say that resonates with this kind of worldviews, and is something that we need to be paying very much attention to. And I do hope that this helps paint a picture, that I didn't take too much time, and I will stop it right there and cannot wait to hear from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Giovanna. That is such a great way to start us off, to really set the scene and actually all the dimensions of gender disinformation, the expansion of the definition, right? Not just women, kind of just general in minorities, thinking about the conditions, right? One of the key things that we learn about the challenge of disinformation is that it's only successful because it mirrors our societies and some of the cracks that already exist. So this is a great place for malign actors to, creep in and exploit those divisions in a very low effort way. And then also thinking about the dimensions and the collaboration between the online world and the physical space, right? And how those two interact. And so I want to kick it over really quickly, first to actually Katarína, because one of the things that you highlighted here was really how it, a lot of this is happening in the space that we occupy, right? So thinking about Central and Eastern Europe and how on the ground, so many of these cultural diplomacy efforts actually happen. Would love to hear, Katarína, from your experience, looking at what is happening on the ground domestically that makes it so that gender disinformation is one of those powerful tools that is used by actors that seek to further divide us.
Thank you, Geysha, for the question. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to this debate. Yes, I would just like to follow up on Maria and to your question. Like, this is what really we see in Central and Eastern Europe. Throughout the past years, we've been analyzing disinformation in this region. We've been analyzing domestic vulnerabilities. And while many people think that most of the disinformation is coming from the East, whether it's the Russia or the Beijing, it is actually increasingly the domestic actors, the domestic political sphere, the state capture of the media landscape, information landscape, the mainstreamization of disinformation and conspiracy theories that are not only being broadcasted by political actors that are on the fringe of the political spectrum, but increasingly people that held, high-level political posts as former prime ministers or ministers in the region. And this is increasingly problematic because then really the debate, the online hate really reflects the mirrors the society, and it reflects the political society, political polarization of our societies or of our regions. So this is one thing that we've observed. I'm coming from Slovakia. Slovakia is one of the few countries which is led by the woman. We have Zuzana Čaputová. She was elected a few years ago as the president of Slovakia. And as soon as she became the head of the country, she became the target of many political representatives and political parties. She's, at the moment, when we look at the information space, she's the number one enemy because she's a beautiful person. So many people compare her as being just a puppet, just a face without no brain. They are undermining her credibility to lead the country, to hold the post as president of Slovakia. Throughout her campaign, and even now, she's labeled as being a puppet of CIA, of puppet of Israeli lobby. These CIA agents, foreign agents, labeling are very common in the region, in our country. So it is really increasingly domestic political actors, whether from far right or far left political sphere, that are actively spreading disinformation that is gendered, hate speech that is gendered, that is targeting women at political leadership posts, but also that are targeting minorities as LGBTQ or minorities as Roma minorities, which is very widespread and in Central Europe. And we actually have data. In GLOBSEC, since 2016, we've been monitoring disinformation and analyzing their impact in societies. And one of the things that we found out that while people, adhere to general democratic principles, when you ask them a general question that, do you think democracy that is based on rule of law, protection of human rights is a good system of government for your country? We get over 80% of respondents saying that, yes, this is what we want. But when you start breaking down those questions on the questions of minorities as LGBTI, when you start to breaking down those questions on human rights of LGBTI community, of gender issues, those 80% seriously dropped to about 30% of respondents adhering to such principles. And that's a huge problem. Another thing that we've observed is a very intensive and long-term smear campaign against liberal policies and liberal politicians. And usually it's the women leaders that tend to, bring those liberal policies, because gender issues are liberal policies. And another thing that really resonates in the region and disinformation sphere is, as Maria pointed out, this East-West fight, where the West is presented as the decadent West trying to, push down the throat these liberal policies on us and destroy our traditional values. And then you have this nationalistic far-right political leaders, of course, supported by the Kremlin propaganda, that are trying to portray that it is them, it is the Kremlin that are trying to protect the traditional values of the country, traditional values when it comes to family. So I'll stay, I want to give a space to other speakers as well, and we can continue the debate with the other things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katarína. That is, especially on the polling, right? When you get to the nitty gritty of it, you start seeing how there's those small cracks here and there that are so easily to insert for these narratives. And so now we've talked to, about the definition, what is happening on the ground, how these narratives are actually being utilized. Now I want to turn it to Arzu, because as an activist, as a journalist, I'm sure everything is peaceful on your end, Arzu. So would love, really to give us a real life context. Not only I know that you have personal stories to share, but very interested too in just generally understanding the intersection between the narratives and the online space, and how, and really seeing how, online harm really plays into this, how the platforms actually have amplified these messages, and just really hearing from you in all of your experience, how this actually comes to play.
Of course, and thank you for having me. It's been really great to hear the previous speakers, because they make my job in a way very easy, because, take everything that they said and apply to journalism, and it still is very much the same, rings true. But also to add to what was said, and based on your questions that you just raised, it has become part of the package of journalism that you do these days, because, as journalists, we've shifted our attention and our publications to online spaces, because this is the demand, this is where people read the news, and this is where you kind of have to be publishing your stories, and where, the newsrooms run their newsrooms online. And so this, I think the shift, first of all, to kind of this approach to this kind of newsmaking and news delivery, didn't give enough time for newsrooms and journalists and freelancers to really prepare for the challenges that they're going to face online. Because, when we think of traditional journalism offline, yes, in certain countries, especially where there are authoritarian tendencies in this region, there are plenty of examples. You're used to threats like intimidation, you're used to threats like, an occasional visit to the police precinct, occasional questioning, libel, defamation suits, these kind of threats. Now, in online journalism, the threats that you're facing, you can't touch them. Like you can't just go to court easily. You can't just deal with it as you would, say, if you were targeted by a government official who claims that you've published wrong information about him, right? In the online space, when you get a comment, usually from anonymous user, who starts accusing you, sharing false information about the stuff that you published, about you as a person, as a journalist, questioning your credibility and questioning your sort of reporting, you can't really deal with it, because, first of all, you don't even know if that person is real or not. The way to learn if that person is real or not takes time and takes knowledge of how to do this kind of research. And then you also have the platforms who often, hiding behind their content moderation policies, don't really give you the adequate response. My experience of dealing with online harassment for the last 7 years has been, you document what happens to you as a journalist, You inform third-party organizations, including organizations such as Reporters Without Borders or the Committee to Protect Journalists or platforms like Access Now, who can help you mitigate the risk, whether it's reporting specific content on a platform that is targeting you, or whether you just want to tell that you're experiencing this kind of harassment online. And that leaves you very little other space to do anything, because at the end of the day, all of this is happening online. And what you would ideally want as a journalist is to have platforms actually do something about it. And they keep saying that they're doing something about it. We keep having these conversations with platforms. They keep pledging that they're going to address misinformation, disinformation on their platforms, and especially how they affect journalists and media practitioners. But at the end of the day, they really don't. And as a journalist, what you end up doing is, you keep battling in this space. First of all, that's new. As I said, shifting from the sort of traditional newsmaking to this online platforms to online spaces. It's really hard to control, especially the narrative that starts targeting you either as a writer, as an editor, or as a newsroom manager, or the newsroom itself. And it also comes in a package, right? You can't just describe or define what's happening to you just by saying, oh, this is online harassment. It's part of a bigger package that includes various forms of threats online, right? There's doxing, there's DDoSing, there is phishing, all kinds of different things. PEN America actually has this great manual on online harassment that specifically it has been written for media practitioners. And there they define all these different threats that exist out there, forms of harassment that exist out there, and they give examples, and they also provide solutions, or at least ways one can deal or manage the threat itself. And so in addition to this variety of threats, you also have to take into account that these type of attacks, it's all part of what we call digital authoritarianism. It has evolved into bringing in these different forms of methods of intimidating civil society at large. And this type of harassment is just one of the ways, because digital authoritarianism by itself also resorts to things like deploying troll armies to go after the critics of the government, or to go after the journalists, for that matter. They deploy specific units that buy very sophisticated surveillance technology to also spy, to also know what you're doing, who you're messaging. Pegasus, the best example to describe this phenomenon. And really, in a nutshell, you're basically in a position where you know how it's all affecting your job, your profession as a journalist. You know potentially who is behind them, and yet there's really little you can do because your hands are tied, again, as I said, either because of the platforms or because of the jurisdictions, the legal jurisdictions within which we live, because every journalist who does face one form of another of harassment online can take this to court eventually, but it really depends on where you live and the kind of jurisdiction your country has and what it allows for. And so I hope this explains sort of the not only the narrative, but also the environment, this new environment of within which journalists these days have to operate, especially with this ongoing online abuse that I call, disinformation for me is just one of the forms that targets journalists specifically.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arzu. You brought so many things at the table, and I definitely want to dig a little bit deeper into, what should be the role of the platforms going forward, whether or not we have some recommendations. I don't want to assume, but I imagine all of us on this conversation happen at the receiving end of whether it's narratives or attacks or harassment online. And so it would be great to hear if we, it's on our minds. So do we have recommendations on that? It also would be great to understand, and I'll post this later, on why should governments care about this particular piece? You brought digital authoritarianism as the broader umbrella, and this being one of the elements. That is certainly something that I'm increasingly hearing across the board. But I want to kind of shift a little bit and focus in on Maria Giovanna's point on, a lot of gender disinformations are effective because it is the challenging of the traditional male, threatening the traditional male empower, dynamic, right? So we are targeting women that are journalists and holding governments accountable. We're targeting women politicians because they are in those positions that were previously held by men. So I think that one of the things that I often hear is the West says it's a problem of the East. The East says it's a problem of the West. And so then we're caught into a hot potato situation. So would love to hear if there, thoughts, Maria Giovanna, perhaps you focused in very much on the West. Why is that narrative kind of off, right? What makes the cultural dynamics in each of the countries so that, hollow ground for some of these attacks, regardless of whether it's West or East?
Yes, thank you. Well, I have to say that so I have, before working on disinformation, I have extensively worked on political cleavages and how they shape our understanding of politics and society. And one thing that we're taught is that the four traditional cleavages do not apply to the East because there was the USSR, which kind of eliminated the possibility of polarization and of people, mobilizing along different social divides and fractures. But, and I will bring back something that I mentioned earlier. Right now, political scientists, there is consensus about the idea that we are living under a new political cleavage, that a new cleavage is materializing and that is transversal, and it's due to globalization and the changes that we've had in our world. And it is what I said earlier about the winners and losers of globalization, about people who feel excited about the possibilities offered by an open economy, an open culture, and an open world, and the people who feel threatened by it, who believe that their way of living is actually undermined or is going to be destroyed. So I believe that on this transversality and the fact that this is something that resonates with the East, West, North, South, and it's something that we're experiencing, much like the pandemic, all at the same time, I believe that these anti-feminist, misogynist ideals talk to this kind of people, and this is why this issue is transversal, and also the kind of battles that we're fighting today for civil rights, for gender equality, for gender empowerment, for the LGBT community. So all of this, I believe, that contributes to create fertile ground for gendered disinformation. And if I can take over one of the questions that you were formulating earlier, Geysha, well, why should governments care? As Lucina Di Mecco said, this is a domestic security threat, or should be treated as such. And it is true, it is a threat for democracy. It is a threat for the safety of women, online and offline, as Arzu mentioned. It is a matter of human rights, of the possibility of women to be heard, to be represented, to participate, and also a matter of digital rights in accessing the internet. And I also would like to underline the fact that in the road to female empowerment, the internet has a different value for men and for women, even in less, let's say, democratic societies. accessing the internet might be a way to educate oneself, to create a community, to express views that cannot be said out loud within the physical community. So, and another thing is the role that perpetuating this type of negative stereotypes has in shaping the views of future generations, if we accept that this should be normalized. I have something to say about the platforms, but maybe I can give the floor to my colleagues first.
Yeah, thank you, Maria Giovanna. We'll get to the platforms. And I think, starting off on the why should governments care is a great path for us to walk down under. I may adjust it a little bit instead of saying why should they care, because I think there is care. I think that there is some acknowledgement that this is a challenge. We do have women in government that consistently are highlighting this to their colleagues, that are putting the message out there. It's just, it gets stifled by other things that are happening in the world. So I wonder if instead of why should they care, the right question is, why should they prioritize this issue above others, right? We've mentioned the human rights angle. I've heard a little bit on the national security piece. Would love to hear, if Arzu, Katarína, you have any thoughts on that, and Maria Giovanna, and before we move on to the platforms, why should this be a priority over the other challenges that we see?
Katarína, okay. Well, this is so good and so important. I guess briefly on the earlier question, I think it's a global issue. Tossing it from one geographical location to another makes no sense. I think studies and conferences and events and plenty of evidence point out to the fact that this is a global issue, and just tossing it from one side to another is an excuse. Frankly speaking, I think it takes away the responsibility when we push it and say, "Oh, well, this is not our issue. It's an East issue." It isn't. It's responsibility for everybody, and that kind of weaves into the question about the governments. I think it's really important to have allies in this conversation, and we do have allies, as you mentioned, Giovanna. There are allies that are trying to address this issue. They are trying to negotiate with other governments who are struggling or who potential interests. So that's definitely an important point to make. But I think, in general, when we think prioritize, the fact that we're even talking about why they should be prioritizing this is also kind of mind-blowing to me, because as a journalist, access to information, access to fair journalism, to objective news coverage is essential for democracy to thrive. This is out of question. So, discussing that whether we should be addressing these issues and whether we should be prioritizing them it's as I said, it's mind-boggling. The way threats intimidate journalists as a result is quite drastic. Some of them feel threatened. Some of them shut down their social media accounts, which is a very important medium for them to reach out to their readers, but also receive information. Some of them feel that they're alone. And perhaps this is where we need to highlight the importance, once again, of governments, but also organizations who can help these journalists to not feel alone and understand that there are ways to seek help if something like this is happening. But also, they feel silenced, and this is the end of your career as a journalist. Like once you the point is to silence you, right? So the priority should be make sure that this doesn't happen, because if a journalist is silenced, if a newsroom is silenced, or if they face a barrage of attacks, then we can't really speak to the future. We can't really speak to democracy. We can't really speak to freedoms, because this is one of the main elements in this conversation. And one other thing, I think the importance of prioritizing also is necessary, because these threats have become a norm. These threats have become consistent, and they have become overt. And there is no consequence for the perpetrators. Almost in all cases, there is no consequence. So the priority should be not only in addressing this, but also finding the right mechanisms, right tools to make sure that this does not continue, or at least there are ways to change the way the threats impact journalists, newsrooms, and whatnot. And what I mean by that is we've had so many different discussions about the phenomenon itself of disinformation, online harassment, how it affects journalism, how it affects civil society in general. But we haven't had conversations where we define what needs to be done and we define deadlines. Like, as a journalist who has attended so many different conversations around this issue, what I want to see next is a deadline of all the actions different actors must take, not want to take or willing to take, but must take, to start really addressing within the priority narrative of these issues.
Thank you, Arzu. Katarína, do you want to jump in on this question too? Why should yes, please?
Yes. I will jump on the question, but also I want to reflect what was said by either by Maria and Arzu in the previous comments. Online harassment, online disinformation against women is global. There's utterly fascinating, but also utterly chilling report that was published last year by UNESCO. They did a survey among over 900 female journalists in 125 countries. Almost 3/4 of these respondents of this, female journalists experience online harassment because of their position, because of their work, because of their gender. There are two things that really stood up for me is the fact that, and this is the answer to your question, why should these be a priority? The first thing is that women, female, women are, are a majority of the world's population. And whether it's the women at positions, whether it's the women at, being journalists, this eventually, online harassment or any kind of harassment that is gender-based, eventually affects over half of the world's population. So that is the first must that we need to be, because the reason why we need to start dealing with this. Another thing is that for the past 2 years, we've been living in pandemic. Most of our work has moved online. And one of the findings of this UNESCO report and study is that we are not only facing the infodemic when it comes to disinformation about COVID and healthcare, but we're also facing a shadow pandemic, which is increasing violence against women during the COVID pandemic. So, that's another reason why I should be dealing with this. And another thing is that the online abuse is significantly becoming a political tool against women in power, against women and journalists, and that should not be acceptable. And these kind of disinformation, whether they're gender-based, they are really disturbing our trust in other people, trust in institutions, and they are destabilizing other societies. They are destabilizing the trust in democratic processes and thus destroying our democracies as such. So this should be really a priority of many policymakers to take, I like what Arzu said, we need deadlines, take measures with deadlines, and then have ordinary people, whether they're women or male, really call up on these leaders and ask them, okay, so you had a particular deadline. What did you do within that time frame?
Thank you, Katarína. I think, it's so interesting to me hearing all of your perspectives, and we will get to deadlines and concrete ideas. But at SIPA, one of the things that we aim to do is really to put a platform and ensure that we're addressing the issue, unpacking it, and really highlighting why it matters for our democracies, why does it matter for our shared democratic values. And the thing is, when I think about what makes a vibrant democracy, I think about good, solid journalism. And I think about, a society that includes women in the economy, because there's economic power in including women in positions of power, and so I think that, those two, for me, would be the thing that I would tell a policymaker. These are two critical pillars of our democracies. You cannot ignore them. And so let's get to the concrete piece, because I think, we're talking deadlines and actions. Let's start with the platforms, because, Arzu, you brought it up earlier. Despite how many years, we've had the online space really be a source of vibrant opportunity for us to engage, to share our information, to learn. It's also provided fertile ground for some of these attacks to go anonymously, right? Making it very easy for people to target. And so would love to hear from this group, what would be some of the concrete recommendations that we would make to platforms where they could, that they could actually take action on right now? And Arzu, perhaps you've been thinking about this, so we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think you probably seen it, but in July of last year, this past summer, Facebook, Google, TikTok, and Twitter committed themselves to tackle the abuse of women on their platforms. And there's a very impressive list of commitments. The success rate, we don't know anything really about, especially, it's only been a few months, but still. And also what is questionable isn't just the success rate, but all the different countries and the usability of all these different commitments within the context of different countries within which these platforms operate. So that brings me to the recommendation. Understanding of country contexts. A lot of these platforms are business oriented. What drives them is financial interest. So the human rights perspective, even though some of them really have good human rights teams, I think the human rights perspective and the understanding of all of the challenges within the countries where they operate is a must. And this cannot be deferred to artificial intelligence technology. And there needs to be human focal points, if that could be like one term to use. The language. This is one of the other biggest challenges that I face having worked with platforms, is that they do lack significantly the knowledge of languages within the countries where they operate, which makes content moderation much harder, which makes response rate much slower, and is really hard then to mitigate the risks. So, in a nutshell, my top recommendations to platforms is not only sign commitments that look really great on paper, but actually pay attention, shift focus to human rights, but also actually employ people who understand the context, who can help in certain contexts, and who speak the local languages. That would be my...
Thank you, Arzu. Katarína, Maria, Giovanna, do you want to comment on platforms, any key recommendations that we would have for them right now?
Yeah, I would just support Arzu. I mean, I live in Slovakia. It's a really small market, Central Europe. When we see this big changes of social media platforms, big transparency policies that are being introduced, most of them do not work in my country or in other small languages. So this is a big must. They're fact-checking AI tools. They work in English, but they really do not work in languages as Hungary or very specific local languages, and markets that are very small eventually for such a big global companies. So social media companies eventually should develop really gender sensitive, human focused solutions on to tackle online attacks, whether it's gender-based or not gender-based, they should really have, or they should really invest more into rapid response units and capabilities to respond to online abuse or reports being done and being reported in all languages. Oftentimes what happens is that you as a researcher or even like ministries in this region, they report disinformation, they report certain Facebook pages to be spreading disinformation. It takes months and months for social media platforms to respond. What often happens is, and what we observed during the COVID pandemic is, a lot of things that were taken down in English-speaking environment, for example, some posts of Breitbart, some posts of Steve Bannon or other conspiracy theories outlets in the United States, they became viral, in other regions, professionally dubbed, with a little sign, this was banned, which even makes it much more appealing to people that believe in conspiracy theories that they need to share with others. So these messages become even more and more viral. So my question is like, if you know, and if you have these videos that were banned, how come they were able to come back in other regions? And once again, the inability to take them down quickly and efficiently is not really working because, as you said, they lack people in each country. They lack teams in each countries to be taking down these malign and abusive messages. In Slovakia, there's one person being a Facebook fact checker. One person covering 3.5 million Facebook user market in Slovakia. And we're lucky because we have that one person. Other countries in the region, they don't even have that one person. But when we have been talking with this guy, with this independent Facebook fact checker, we were asking him like, so what's the impact of your work? And he doesn't know. He was not able to tell us, what are the processes when he himself, marks something down? What kind of impact does it even have on the information community and the spread of such malign content? So this is a must, increasing the local people working for Facebook who understand the local political landscape, the nuances, the language is a must. And then, of course, there's a need to change the business aspect of social media platforms, because disinformation is a good business. Spread of disinformation is a good business. And we've seen that, at the moment, some of the models of social media platforms are really supporting the abusive part of information sharing. And the messages that are really inciting fear, messages that are inciting violence are being empowered by the AI of social media platforms. And that needs to change.
Thank you, Katarína. And Maria Giovanna, I don't know if you also have recommendations for platforms, but I would want to pair it up, looking at the time and knowing that we're almost at the end. We could talk about this for hours, and hopefully this is not it for this conversation. But we have a lot of elections in 2022. This is a year of many elections across Europe, even in the United States. We have our midterm elections. So what would be the recommendation for governments? And then I will wrap up with the so what should people get out of this? Like, so what for audiences that are not really in our space, not really following these issues? Why should they care? Maria Giovanna, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you for your question, which is a very complicated one to end up with, I have to say. Well, I believe that governments do need to hold the platforms accountable, and this is something that is happening, and a conversation that is thankfully evolving due to the DSA that is being discussed in these days, the amendments, and also the Digital Services Act will represent a step forward, absolutely, and it it is something that I believe needs to occur at the EU level, exactly because the internet has no borders. So we need to act together. And in this regard, the important thing to understand is that at present, the notice and take down model of the platforms is not enough. Automated content moderation is not enough. And there should be an holistic design approach to disinformation with also risk assessment of the systemic risks. And governments need to address this. A very virtuous model that we saw was, and the Disinfo Lab wrote a piece about it during the German elections. We mapped the initiatives that the governments, the parties, civil society, independent fact checkers were entailing to stop electoral disinformation. And there were many. There was still a lot of disinformation, but it's a very good suggestion that something is happening and something can be done. And response is also to do it together, to get engaged also civil society organizations, to call local experts, to call people who understand the context, and to raise the level of awareness of this. So again, I know that it's a little bit out-fashioned, let's say right now, to speak still about the media literacy and the digital literacy, but I do believe that this needs to play some role, because I want to have hope for the future generations, and as also native digital users, they are unfortunately very early on experienced on disinformation and cyberbullying and all the negative that unfortunately comes with the internet, which can be a beautiful place and needs to be kept safe and free.
Wonderful. Katarína, Arzu, anything on the government side?
Are you sure you want to ask this question to me? You know, one of the hardest things to think of when you think of recommendations to governments is knowing that the likelihood of them actually taking what you're recommending into account and acting on it is quite small. But nevertheless, I'm still going to say it. My recommendation would be to actually adhere to their commitments that they have signed up for under all of the international treaties that they become members of or have signed up for. I think this is the underlining recommendation, the first recommendation I would give. The second recommendation for the governments is, especially if we think of in the context of allies, for the allies to hold governments who use technology, authoritarian technology, to crack down on civil society, to act more responsibly, to actually hold companies that sell this surveillance technology to these governments to account, come up with better business, rules and regulations that would prevent this type of sale, this type of business transaction taking place. Provide support, once again, in terms of allies, provide support to the actors who are mitigating the risks in between those affected and where they're affected. So if we're talking about journalists being subject to threats or some kind of attacks online and they need help with getting their account back on social media platform, there are a number of different organizations that provide this kind of support. So continue providing support to these platforms, because they do an incredible amount of work. Because you know, what Katarína mentioned about the ministry waiting for a response, I mean, months is okay. Like, you know, this happens all the time. And for journalists often who have, you know, accounts hacked, their Facebook gone, and their Facebook pages gone, where they have to be sharing news. You know, they work with these platforms to get back their accounts, to restore the news. So provide this kind of support to these platforms, to these organizations that do mitigate in between, that act as bridges. And finally, as I said earlier, we need concrete deadlines and we need to act upon them. And we need to stop saying, or sort of playing the diplomacy card, because it affects everybody. It eventually will affect even the societies within the democratic governments as well. And we're seeing this already happening. So yeah, take it seriously.
Wonderful. And Katarína, if you want to jump in 30 seconds.
Yes, I'll be quick. Not to repeat Maria and Arzu. I think that the first thing that politicians and the governments can do is to update their legislation. Often we live very much in an online environment, and our legislation doesn't reflect that. So we need to update our legislation to reflect the realities and technological developments that we are living in. We need to improve legal and judicial responses to online environments and online violence. And with this sense, we need to educate, police, prosecutors, and judges to be able to respond to these things that are happening on a daily basis. So that would be my contribution to recommendations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katarína. And I just want to end it with the so what? If in 15 seconds you could have the one thing that you would want the audience to take away from this conversation, what would be it? Maria Giovanna?
Definitely to take it seriously and to understand that this is something that concerns all of us, even if we feel like we come from privilege, from a position of disinterest in politics or whatever. It's still affecting us because we all live in the same society, and let's say that online spaces do reflect it. So we all need to act upon it.
Arzu?
I mean, not much to add to Maria Giovanna's point, but that they could be also the persons to help. And going back to the very first introduction, speaking about online harassment and the types of threats women face, they can be the people who can actually be helping those women journalists, representatives of marginalized groups, even a supportive hand, going online, trying to diffuse the tension, taking over accounts of friends that they know who are facing these kind of attacks, providing the mental support counts a lot. So that would be my so what.
Katarína?
I will just support what Maria and Ezra said, that we need to take action, but action also in the sense that say no to disinformation, say no to online harassment, and call upon political leaders that eventually spread it. Say no, that this is not normal and this is something that you're not going to accept, because sometimes, especially in online environment, you have this minority of active bots or people that are just angry, that are just shouting, and this majority of people who are there are silent because they know that this is not okay, and this majority needs to take over. We need to really express that this is not okay and we're not going to accept it, and call upon our political leaders to take actions. And we as a majority should be, as Azra said, not only offering the help, but if we see disinformation or some kind of behavior that is not okay and that should not be okay, we should just report it and express our opinion that this is not okay.
Wonderful. Katarína, Arzu, Maria Giovanna, thank you so very much for lending us your voices today, your expertise. Hopefully this is one of many conversations with a deadline for action at the end of it to come. Thank you again to the U.S. Embassy in Bratislava for their support of this event. And for all of those that have tuned in, continue to follow SIPA for more analysis on this and other issues that are critical to the Transatlantic Alliance. Thank you so much and goodbye.